We get going. I will convene our meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, May 9th, 2023. Welcome to all who are here. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Are there any changes to it?
Andy, on item 7, the minutes from the April 25th meeting are not quite ready to be approved, so we'll hold off on that until the next meeting.
Okay, so we'll hold off on the minutes. Anything else?
No.
All right, then we'll have our agenda as amended. Item 2 is the public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to us, either on an item on our agenda or on any other topic you may want. Charles, do we have anyone to speak to us?
Yes, we're going to start with Kidder Spader. He was here first, so Kidder, I'm going to allow you to talk, and you should be able to speak.
Yep. Can you guys all hear me now?
Yes.
Yep. I just wanted to take an opportunity to introduce myself. I'm purchasing the old synagogue at 168 Archibald Street, which is the corner of Archibald and Hyde Street. And right now it is in a mixed use neighborhood, or sorry, it's in a medium density neighborhood, and it's a commercial building. So I am exploring the opportunity of maybe making it into a mixed use building just to open up further uses for the building. And right now it abuts the mixed use section of North Winooski Street. So I have given Charles some kind of basic information. And like I said, I'm just here to introduce the concept, possibly going forward. Done.
Okay, thank you.
And Andy, and commissioners, just FYI, I did forward that communication on to you. So let me know if you have any questions.
Great, thank you.
Right. All right, next we'll go to Barbara Hedrick.
Hello, Barbara.
Second.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay,
welcome.
thank you. Thank you for all the work you do. I'm here to speak about the Joint Institutional Parking Management Plan. I send you emails with some Excel spreadsheet, lots of data analysis I did over the past week and a half. And it's really worth digging into, but I'll give you the highlights now. First, I want to call your attention to page 22 of the Joint Institutional Parking Management Plan. Between 2015 and 2022, so over the past 7 years, UVM's SOV rate for employees has gone up from 52% to 62%. So that's a 10% increase in SOV rates. For commuter students who live more than half a mile away from campus, their SOV rate has gone from 30% to 39% over the past 7 years. So this upward trend in SOV rates really is completely contradictory to the city's goals for reducing pollution, reducing SOV. And it's also shows, I believe, in my opinion, that UVM's TDM, transportation demand management programs, are ineffective. The report lists or mentions their TDM efforts, but we really need to see effectiveness data on TDM in future, if this report gets modified, which I hope, and going forward, because TDM is not just ridership numbers, it's how is it replacing SOV traffic? And that's what we need to see UVM do, is implement new programs to reduce their SOV rates. So next, I'd like to call your attention to page 47 of the Joint Institutional Parking Management Plan. This is UVM's current supply and demand analysis. There are 2 methodologies shown here. One is where the cars are counted in the parking lots. And as one of the commissioners mentioned in the last meeting, the count is very low. And she was wondering why. They counted 3,508 cars on campus at peak demand time. So I dug into that after the last meeting, and that number just has to be wrong. And the reason is because if you take all the cars that students who live on campus have on campus, and UVM sold more than 1,000 permits to students who live on campus with cars. And then you take all the employees who are there during the day and have cars on campus, and that number is 2228 according to the top line in that chart on page 47. You add those two together, and there's not enough room left to account for commuter students parking on campus, which is actually quite high because, as I just pointed out, 39% drive SOV to campus, and UVM sells more than 1,000 permits. It's like 1,600 something permits to off-campus students. Of course, a good portion of that are those who live more than half a mile away. So because that number under the counting cars in the parking lot methodology is too low, that means that supply and demand analysis is wrong, and we should ignore the result that shows at the bottom line 1,300 parking space surplus. That's just not, that cannot be correct based on the numbers I just explained. And if you want to dig into it further, it's in my Excel spreadsheet. Just look at the tabs at the bottom of the Excel spreadsheet, because they each build up to the supply and demand analysis. So what I'm recommending is that we focus solely on the data that's provided on page 47 using this survey methodology. And even this approach needs to be modified because, the cars, people with permits can't park all day in short-term parking spaces because those are only for 15 minutes. They can't park in business use parking spaces, and most people can't use ADA spaces. So when you take out these restricted parking spaces, and I got this data out of the 2019-2024 JIP report, and that data was reported by UVM in the fall of 2018. That's not so long ago. I don't think there's been a big change in those number of parking spaces across the whole campus system. So that increases the deficit you see on page 47 under the survey method, which is like -78. That increases it by 500. And then there are some other changes. The survey method says the survey method has its problems because so few people were surveyed. And so there's a large margin of error. And for example, the survey method reports 971 parking spaces are needed by students who live on campus and have cars, but that's understated by 215 because there are more than 1,000 students who live on campus and have cars. So all told, when you add up all these different corrections, which I put in the email to you, I believe UVM's parking deficit is somewhere between 1,400 and 1,900 parking spaces. It's a huge parking deficit. And that means those cars are parking on street. And the data that UVM provides on page 20 that looks at what percent are parking on street, that has to be understated. I know that more than 261 cars are parking on the street. Commuter cars are parking on the street. Because at least half of them are on my street. And I know other neighborhoods are affected too. All right, so the bottom line here is UVM has a parking deficit right now. According to their numbers, it's -78, plus or minus a margin of error of 1,046. That means that their parking deficit could be as much as 1,100 cars. I think it's more than that. And that means that I'm asking the Planning Commission to please recognize that this means UVM's parking strategy is not meeting the objectives or goals of the city ordinance section, Article 8. And I think it would be very helpful for us to reject the JIP or send it back for more work, so that UVM and CATMA can work together to put in far more information about what is UVM going to do to reduce this SOV rate and that trend. They can't just keep doing the same thing. They have to do something differently, and my email outlines some of those ideas. Moving on. The plan project list on page 43 and 44. One, the list doesn't have enough details for us to know exactly what the parking impacts are going to be from each of these projects, but we definitely need to dial down and get more information wherever there's a change in parking. For example, on page 44, Coolidge Hall gets demolished, and the very next line says a new dorm, and it has 190 parking spaces. Well, in the previous JIP report, when Coolidge Hall was getting demolished, there was a loss of 10 spaces. So that new dorm, which sure looks like it's a replacement dorm for Coolidge because it's the very next line on that list, is actually going to have a 200-car parking structure on the ground floor. We need to talk about that with UVM because any parking structure is going to affect the nearby neighborhood and also the overall parking supply and demand. And we need to better understand UVM's parking strategy. On pages 52 and 62, UVM mentions its efficiency parking strategy. It uses coded words that aren't clear and no explanation of what their efficiency parking strategy is. So those sentences either need to be deleted, or better yet, UVM needs to spend some considerable chunk of text telling us exactly what their efficiency parking strategy is. If there's any report to explain their parking strategy, it's this JIP report. The change that UVM wants to make to the footnote at the bottom of page 44 is not satisfactory because the Coolidge replacement dorm was not on the JIP report last year, and the replacement dorm for Coolidge Hall is not exactly on the same footprint that Coolidge Hall is. It's a little bit closer to Robinson Hall. So the suggested text coming from UVM is not okay. It needs more work. We need time to get that right before this JIP's approved, because that project is not good for that site. You shouldn't have a parking garage on, like, Redstone Lofts has parking garage on the first floor and then dorms above it. That is not right for the Redstone historic green area, besides the traffic impacts. And it doesn't reduce SOV rates and it doesn't reduce pollution. So it's inconsistent with section 8.1.16 in the article.
Barbara?
Yeah.
You've been going about 10 minutes.
Sorry.
You know about how much you were able to start winding up?
Yes, I will do that right now. Thanks.
Thank
I don't think it's right for UVM to delete that line on the parking management plan that takes Coolidge out and then say, oh, that project's further up the list and we can't tell you where that'll be because we haven't decided yet, when in fact they already have in their housing strategy document where they want to build dorms. I think I'm done, Andy. I really appreciate everybody's patience while I went through that.
Thank you. Charles, do we have anyone else?
Yes, we're gonna go next to Lisa Kingsbury.
Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I sent a communication to the Planning Commission, but it was at the end of the day. So I just want to speak to it because I'm assuming you probably haven't had a chance to hear it, and I wanted other members of the public to hear it as well. And it is regarding this misconception that we are intending to take down Coolidge Hall and replace it with another dorm. I know Barbara's getting into semantics of at or near. There's no intention to do that. There's no intention to put 190 space parking structure at or near that site. So I just want to go through a couple of things. the removal of Coolidge Hall was in the previous JIP, and as the text before table 11 indicates, that this table both updates projects from that previous JIP, whether they're complete, not moving forward, or planned for the next 5 years, and also identifies new projects for the next 5 years. And we are making an edit to table 11 to move that Coolidge Hall piece to not moving forward at this time. We have no plans for that site in the next 5 years. That's consistent with the other projects that were identified in the previous JIP that we do not have plans to move forward on. The 190 spaces of residential housing that was noted in the unknown category, that is an error. I know that was noted at the last meeting, and that is getting removed. That is a double count from further up the, further up in the table, where there are 2 future housing projects and housing to accommodate parking at those. So that was a double count. That line is coming out. It never should have been there. I apologize. It was my error. I've caused confusion, and I didn't mean for that to happen. The fact that that error is directly under Coolidge Hall is simply an unfortunate coincidence. Because they were next to one another does not mean they're linked. Most of the projects on the list are not linked to another project just by where they fall on the table. I do understand the confusion based on that language and the fact that the other housing projects have parking directly underneath them, but truly this was simply an error. It was noted at the last meeting. It will be rectified. And then finally, as noted again earlier in table 11, there are 2 future student housing projects and parking to accommodate them in 2005 and 2016. Both of those already have footnotes. I'm not going to read through exactly what the footnotes say, but essentially it talks about where we are in the process of rezoning for Trinity Campus, that the City Council has tabled it. At this point, it's unclear where that is going to go, but we are continuing to actively explore options for more housing, whether that's on Trinity Campus or elsewhere on our campus lands. What we are adding into that footnote is language that says UVM is not in a position to discuss the other sites publicly at this time. None of the sites are associated with a project from the previous JIP to remove Coolidge Hall, which is not moving forward at this time. So I just hope that provides some clarity for the commission, and then for any of our neighbors that have seen this table and also been confused and thought that we were planning to take down Coolidge Hall and build a new housing project there with 190 spaces. That is not in our planning. Thank you for your time and for your work on this.
Thank you. Charles, do we have anybody else?
Yes, we're gonna next go to, and sorry if I'm getting your name wrong, Livia DeMartis.
Yeah, hi, and I apologize. I'm joining from Callahan Park after Little League practice, so if there's noise in the background, but I just wanted to say that I guess share Barbara's concerns about more traffic, more noise, more everything in the South Prospect neighborhood. If more student housing is built right on Redstone campus or directly adjacent to it. And I guess I understand that UVM isn't in a position to share other locations at this time, but I guess I just want a better understanding of what our ability to participate in the process would be as neighbors if down the road something is proposed in the immediate vicinity, because I guess I just don't want it. I guess everything I've heard so far makes me think that this plan that's being discussed tonight doesn't foreclose the neighbors from kind of getting in on the ground floor in discussions of future dorms, which is, I guess, important to me. I don't want anything that's in the plan tonight to limit our ability to question and raise concerns about future dorms and parking in our immediate vicinity.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I think
thank you.
I think we'll be actually addressing that a little bit later on.
Okay, great.
Charles?
Andy, it looks like that is it. I see Bruce, I'm attempting to promote you to panelist, if you're able to do that. Not, I can also allow you to talk. It doesn't look like we have anybody else here from the public, so
Okay, great, thank you. So we'll close the public forum. We're on to item 3, which is the chair's report, and I don't have anything to report today, so we'll go on to item 4, which is the director's report. Megan.
Sorry, we were on mute. Great, I have just a couple updates for you tonight. She's not here tonight, but we are celebrating Sarah Morgan's 1-year anniversary of working in the department this week. Really exciting that we've reached that milestone, and I know you've heard recent presentations from her on things that she's been working hard on. We also wanted to note that the council is currently accepting applications for appointments. We do have 2 commissioners that are up for reappointment this year, and we'll be notifying you to let you know, to remind you about that and to let you know the details and deadlines for when applications are due if you intend to reapply. One other update for you, for those commissioners that have been on for several years, you may remember that before COVID, we used to prepare an annual report of the activities that you had been working on as a body, and Andy or the chair and the staff would present that to the city council. That's been on pause for several years, but we have been notified that they are going to resume those reports this year. So we anticipate that later this summer or into the fall, we will work with you to draft a report on the activities from the last year. And then one final thing, I think you all know that this is our only planning commission meeting in May. That's in part because both Charles and I are going to be out intermittently over the next, actually really the rest of this month. So just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. I know Charles is working to reschedule the council ordinance committee maybe for early next month. But otherwise, we look forward to resuming our work with you in June. And that's all I have, Andy.
Great, thank you. So we'll close that and we'll move on to item 5, which is the 2023-2028 Joint Institutional Parking Management Plan. This is a continuation of our discussion from the last meeting. We had at our last meeting a number of comments and questions, and so we look forward to hearing back on some of those questions, and then we'll we can have further comments and questions from the commission. But I want to start this discussion off just by asking Megan to remind us what our role is on this and what the impact of the parking management plan is. And it, I guess that one of the questions that we got during public forum was actually dovetails with this, is picking up on that question, is what impact does this have on the public's ability to question any future plans or anything like that?
Great, happy to speak to that, Andy. And also I'll note Scott Gustin is here. Scott has a much longer history of working with the plan and with the permitting side of using the plan. So happy to have him jump in if there's anything else to add here. So yeah, to start, this is a plan that is prepared for and potentially approved by the DRB for up to 5 years, which documents the sort of unique ability of the institutions to manage their parking resources individually and collectively in ways that are maybe different from our underlying parking requirements. That was especially relevant before our zoning ordinance was changed to rely on maximum parking limits rather than minimum on-site parking requirements. So the role of the Joint Institutional Parking Management Plan has shifted a little bit. In that prior Joint Institutional Parking Plans were really used to help document what the institution's anticipated parking demand was, what their supply was, and to ultimately serve as a sort of waiver from their minimum on-site parking limits that could be then used to satisfy just the parking requirement component of future zoning permit applications. with us transitioning from minimum to maximum parking requirements in the city, this really functions more as a plan for us to understand what the institutions are anticipating their demand to be and how they are managing that demand. There are standards in the ordinance for what types of information are required to be provided as part of this plan. And there are still requirements that the plan be approved by the DRB after consultation with the Planning Commission. So I think, Andy, to your first question, the role of the Planning Commission is to review this draft plan and to provide comments and or any recommendations you might have to the DRB as they consider this plan. After the plan has been reviewed by the Planning Commission, it will go to the DRB. Ultimately, the DRB will hold a public hearing and then consider approval of the plan for up to 5 years. If approved by the DRB, the plan is then used as part of the permitting process for the institutions. So I think to the second question, this plan does not in any way approve the individual projects that are listed within the plan. So we were talking about specific residential buildings, whether or not they're going to be built, what they might include. This is simply a record of what the institutions anticipate they will be building in the next 5 years and how the parking and transportation elements of those projects are being planned for. When an individual project comes in to seek a permit, it's reviewed by Scott and his team and likely the DRB in most cases, given the scale of these projects. And the plan is then consulted to determine if that project is consistent with the information that was in the plan. If it's not, a project can still be approved, but ultimately an addendum to the plan needs to be submitted that provides additional information or makes corrections to the information that was presented in an approved plan. So I think any of the mechanisms that exist today in terms of notification about a pending permit, opportunities to weigh in about those permits, opportunities to participate in public hearings before DRB permits are issued, all of that remains. This is just a tool to help us understand the parking and transportation component of those projects.
Great, thank you for that reminder. Scott, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that, but.
I would just elaborate a little bit. Megan pointed out that nothing about calling out projects and the parking plan entails approval of those projects. As she said, it's really a plan about what's anticipated on a 5-year horizon within the institutions. Pretty routinely, not everything in the plan shows up as an actual project for application review. But this serves as a little bit different tool than your typical non-institutional application wherein the DRB or staff, as the case may be, looks at Article 8 and parking management for each standalone project. Whereas this is a little bit different. This is, as Megan said, a plan that I hesitate to say pre-approved, but the anticipated projects need to be incorporated into this plan. And as part of the plan, the institutions need to demonstrate how these projects balance parking supply and demand. So it's a little bit different in that respect.
Thank you. Any questions on this from the commission? All right, then, again, thanks Megan and Scott for, Michael?
Can I ask Scott a quick question?
Sure.
And it's also a little bit on background. I remember, when we did the parking work, that this was a key piece to allowing any kind of future permitting to occur, this having the institutional management plan in place. But can you help me, Scott, as just on background, like when we did Trinity, we removed the major project review, I believe. Obviously that Trinity amendment has not passed, but as far as it passed the Planning Commission. And so for other places on campus, what's the sort of standard of review from the DRB, especially given the fact that it's a state university?
I can also speak to that if I'll let Scott go and then I can share some thoughts too. Go ahead, Scott.
So the standard of review, I mean, you mentioned major impact, is that right, Michael?
Yeah, when we looked at Trinity, I remember we took out the major impact review, and that was what I believe tied it to DRB. So unless there's, I guess what I'm trying to get at is if there isn't a zoning amendment that's done, what review or sort of public vote, I guess, would otherwise take place for something that happens on campus aside from the parking management plan?
So the major impact review and the parking management plan are both independent things.
Understood. Understood. What I'm getting at is
What would bring a project before the DRB?
correct.
Right.
Anything that's, how do I say this? Anything that's a level 2 project, which in layman's terms is a bigger project, based on the threshold articulated in the CDO, or a major impact or a conditional use. All three of those would go to the board. So if right now Trinity wanted to build an outbuilding, that's probably something that's administrative. If they wanted to build a $50,000 addition, which is still pretty small, but that's big enough to be a level 2, that would likely go to the board. But even that small addition would need to be accounted for in this parking management plan.
And just for clarity, the Trinity amendment did not remove Trinity campus from being part of major impact at all. It just had it currently it has its own threshold for when a project on that campus has to go through major impact. So we were removing that specific threshold to just make it consistent with the rest of the institutional campuses. So projects on this campus will still go through major impact if they are above that size. And I think maybe another way to say that last point that Scott made is that, you know, we're really focused on the ability of folks to engage or for the DRB to hear projects, but I think it's also important to note that there are notification processes and appeal rights, et cetera, that people have for administrative permits that got issues that aren't heard by the DRB. So as Scott was saying there at the end, the GIP standards specifically, you know, call out kind of minor work like replacing a sidewalk or roofing that don't necessarily need to be reflected in the GIP in order to proceed with a permit. But all of those requirements of, you know, public notification and access to the process exist regardless.
So just a point of clarification, at risk of mission creep here a little bit. Major impact doesn't apply to institutional projects, but that's different from things going to the DRB, right? You can have projects go to the DRB, independent of whether there's conditional use or major impact. So that's sort of, well, I'll leave it at that. They can go to the board based on their size, and what gets built needs to be addressed in the parking management plan. And if it's not, as Megan had said earlier, it needs to stand on its own and be incorporated into future parking management plans.
Great. I appreciate the background there.
Anyone else on this topic? Then let me just bring it back to the commission generally. Any comments, questions about the plan itself? And then we could hear from UVM if there are any updates that they want to provide with us or the parking folks.
I do have some questions and comments about the draft, but I do have one question about what you just said, Scott. I think I was following until you said that that the institutional projects do not fall under major impact. Can you just explain that again?
Yeah, I was
So-
curious about that as well.
I'm pulling it up now because I knew that was gonna come back. So I'm looking at section 3.5.3 exemptions to major impact. And exemption E refers to the statutory limitation in 4413. So projects where the scope and authority of municipal regulation is limited by statute pursuant to 24 VSA 4413. So that includes schools, hospitals, state lands, solid waste facilities and schools.
Okay, thank you. That's actually a really helpful clarification because that didn't come up at all in the context of our question of the Trinity zoning amendment. You know, we were looking at the table above that talks about the fact that major impact is applicable in the institutional districts and relying on those underlying thresholds. So there's a difference here between the district itself and the individual entity that's building a project for that purpose. So that's actually, I'm glad that you highlighted that, Scott. But yes, I think that's a little bit of scope creep. As Scott mentioned, there are other ways that larger projects might still go for the DRB for review.
Right. I mean, typically big UBM projects go to the board. They just don't go through major impact. I mean, major impact is a set of criteria that address a project's impacts on city infrastructure.
And Julia, did you say you had other comments or questions?
Yeah, I can start. Let's see. I think it would be helpful to see the plan with the corrections updated. I know there were a couple that we talked about from last time, including that table with planned projects and the error in that. But there were a couple other things that we mentioned too. So it would just be helpful to see that updated version of the document to, you know, make sure that we're looking at the final thing. I did not see the Excel sheets that Barbara was mentioning. Just an FYI, I'm not sure. I did see the communication that was in the packet. I think, let me go to the page I'm looking at here. So Barbara brought up efficiency-based standards, and I think it's important to talk about those. And on page 19 and page 20, there's some discussion of that and definitions there. I do think that the definition that's offered here is a little bit circular and not as clear as it could be to try to explain what efficiency-based standards are. I know this document is super technical and that's how it's meant to be used, but given that efficiency based standards are kind of the basis for the document and kind of the new approach that's outlined here, that's less focused on they cite 85th percentile occupancy as the previous standard. Given that efficiency-based standards are the new operative direction here, I feel like there should be a clearer definition given here. Right now it says, I'll just read, in parking management, efficiency-based standards refer to provision of optimal parking supply in an efficiently managed system. So efficient parking is efficient. These systems avoid the tendency to supply parking in excess while balancing appropriate pricing structures and recognizing the costs associated with oversupply. And it continues on. I do think it would just be helpful to provide some sort of example or other definition that's a little bit clearer. The footnotes do reference the articles and documents from the Urban Land Institute that kind of are foregrounding this approach, and that's great. I have not had the chance to review those myself, but given that efficiency is so important going forward, I just think it would be helpful to have a more clear definition there. And then I have some comments that I would be eager to hear other commissioners' thoughts on about how this document could sort of transform in the future to be more inclusive of other modes of travel and parking. I think one of the limitations of this document is that it is so focused on parking and vehicle travel alone, and to try to encompass all of the TDM strategies in a document that originally was just intended to figure out the appropriate amount of parking is like difficult to begin with. So I know we mentioned the role of the ongoing TDM study and how it relates to this process last time, but I'm hopeful that through that process, that report can offer some recommendations on ways that this parking plan could be more inclusive of other modes, and just approach transportation more holistically, as opposed to just a focus on parking provision. So yeah, that's my broad thought there. And then I do have one other thought on neighborhood parking, that's somewhat related to approaching parking more and transit more holistically in this document and future ones. I think it's really easy to look at, I don't know, this document provides very flat numbers for, okay, we have this amount of demand for parking and then we have this amount of supply. And last time we talked about how, that kind of glosses over the nuances of different user groups and times of day and things like that. And I think it also glosses over just the experience of trying to park in these places. And frequently people are not thinking about like, okay, I have my designated spot on the UVM campus and I'm going to park there to do whatever I need to do, attend class, work, whatever. I feel like people are often just looking for an available spot. And so some of this pressure on neighborhood parking is a problem of convenience, of people wanting to just park in places that are more convenient to them, and that are visible to them, as opposed to parking in designated spots. And I think this is another way that like a future version of this document could be more inclusive of TDM strategies, by talking about information and wayfinding and other strategies in more detail, to illustrate the ways that the institutions can support not just, providing parking at an appropriate level as a whole, but also directing people to the parking that is supposed to be provided for them, for their purpose, and then reducing issues and burdens on neighborhoods where people are parking in residential spots. So those are my general thoughts.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, I thought Julia made a lot of great observations, and I was just thinking about how to kind of make some of those actionable. The thing that I observed, Julia, that I think is similar to your discussion of mode split is that like, there's public transit and then each institution is running its own shuttles everywhere. The other day I had an experience where was walking to work in the rain and had been hoping to take a bus. And of course, like 3 shuttles of 3 different institutions passed me on the way, but none of those I could get on. So, like that's a great way to try and that holistic approach that Julia's talking about in our TDM efforts to try and tie those in, and maybe even using the TDM effort to provide recommendations on this to how most make it effective, because it sort of grew out of exemptions to the parking requirements. And that's why it's focused on this this kind of narrow supply to demand range. But now it clearly has other objectives, as we heard in some of the public comment, which is about like, how many people are driving alone to work or to school or whatever. Those are sort of like symptoms that affect supply and demand, but are different in a way. They aren't solved by creating more spaces or less spaces. They're solved by TDM or whatever, or honestly, housing that's closer to campus is probably what that is actually solved by. So, so maybe not for this round, but I think it'd be great for us to think about and staff to think about how we, and I don't even know what we're allowed to do, but how we think about re-envisioning this as a new tool for what I think are now different objectives than it probably started with prior to the zoning change. And I echo a lot of Julia's thoughts.
Andy, could I speak to that last point?
Yes.
You may remember that this discussion came up a bit in the context of making the changes to Article 8 earlier well, I guess it was last year at this point. Both for our overall TDM requirements for non-institutional projects, as well as a bit in the context of what are we really trying to achieve in the institutional parking plans. And that was actually something that we specifically recommended, that instead of just kind of throwing in standards or specific metrics that we want TDM plans to meet, that we actually use the work that's happening as part of this TDM study to guide us on clarifying our goals and objectives for TDM across the city. So I am saying that to say I agree with what Julia and Mike are saying.
Thanks. Anyone else? So if not, let's hear from the institutions, from CATMA and the institutions. I know we had questions last time. I know there were a variety of comments, and I think there were some, you're going to come back with some responses and some updates for us. So let's.
So we have a number of folks here, at least from UVM and CATMA and the consultant Karen Sentoff from VHB. And I was actually wondering maybe if we could tee up their response to questions by sharing their reply to a couple of questions that staff had sent to Josh and Sandy at CATMA about a couple issues that you've heard some public comment about, and I think there were some questions about last week. So we had specifically reached out to CATMA to further describe and kind of answer the question about how do we understand and utilize the data that they've provided from their survey and the margins of error that are embedded within that. And we didn't focus a whole lot on this, but we did also have a question about Champlain's kind of position for parking supply in the future. So hoping that maybe we could start with them just sharing the responses that they wrote to us, and then we can get into other specific in the weeds questions about the report as well.
That'd be great.
Awesome. Thanks y'all for having us. Appreciate it, and appreciate all the questions and comments from all of you in the public. Starting with, I'll start by addressing the question from the city, and then Karen, who's our consultant for VHB, can jump in if she feels like she has anything else to add. Regarding UVM's high margin of error, there is a high margin of error for the demand calculation of around 1,000 spaces, give or take. That is mostly due to using a different survey methodology, or using a policy change in UVM and how they allow us to survey, and how they just do surveying in general is a random sample of 1,000 employees and 1,000 students, as opposed to the entire population of UVM, which we used to survey. So this does create a large margin of error. However, we do, as mentioned last meeting, have these utilization counts, which have been going on since fall 2019, which are lot counts that happen 4 times a year. During those 4 time slots, they happen 3 days for 3 counts. So we get a whole bunch of utilization data from all the institutions on how many people actually are on the ground using their parking, and there's a larger surplus there than our demand calculation calculates. So due to that, we feel fairly confident that even though there's a large margin of error, our demand is in a good place. In reality, the demand probably lies somewhere between our demand calculation and that utilization number, the true demand, because not everyone who's demanding parking is necessarily on campus during those times. And another answer for why those utilization numbers and demand numbers are a little different is kind of due to the prevalence of telework and how we're still like grasping that in our survey. how we kind of ask the primary mode, how we ask the question on how are you getting to work. We just ask, what is your primary mode? And so that is, you can give one answer, whether it's driving or biking or another answer. And now folks are working different like hybrid schedules. So they're not coming in 5 days a week. So while their main mode might be driving to work, they're not driving in every day. So those numbers kind of are mismatched because of that. And we want to work on how to better capture that telework in our future surveys, which we do every fall. So there will be more work to come with that. And hopefully we'll get a better number or something that we find, or a different number for that in our update. And then regarding Champlain College's parking deficit, again, I would refer to that demand number, which shows a parking deficit as kind of the lower end of the spectrum of what the demand actually is, or the higher end of the spectrum, sorry, of what that demand actually is, versus the utilization counts, which are showing that Champlain has a surplus of over 215 spaces. And so again, while that utilization count cannot be used to project future demand, it does give us a good idea of like what is happening on the ground right now, which is showing in actuality a surplus of parking on the ground. And I'll stop there, see if anyone has any questions or you want me to elaborate on anything further.
Any questions for Josh on that? Julia?
Thanks, Josh. I'm interested in hearing, like, what do you think is a healthy rate of surplus with this, approach going forward? Can that vary?
Yeah, I'm gonna Karen, our consultant from VHB, I want to see if she can touch on that question a little bit. Karen.
Evening, everyone, and thank you. Julia, I think this gets back a little bit to that concept of efficiency-based standards, right? There's an inherent cost to oversupplying parking, and we certainly don't want our neighboring institutions to have wide open fields of parking that are not utilized for many reasons. And I think it strikes that idea that you brought up earlier of the experience of trying to park, and sort of that convenience factor of finding spaces that are nearby to where your destination is, or potentially on campus based on policy of where you are intended to park, based on the permit that you hold. And so I think this concept of efficiency-based standards helps to illuminate the idea that those things should be in close balance, and that we wouldn't want to have a significant surplus of parking, and to the same tune, we wouldn't want to have a significant deficit of parking, so that folks aren't able to find spaces. And I think there are many mechanisms that can be utilized to sort of make sure that that balance is struck. And the idea in my mind of this plan is in some ways to demonstrate what are some of those mechanisms that the institutions are leveraging to make sure that that balance is struck pretty closely without having things tilted, one way or the other too significantly.
So do you think that, they're at a healthy point right now, each institution? And I don't know, just a little bit more and that would be helpful.
I would say, in my opinion, yes, given that I've dug into the numbers and looked at them very carefully. This idea that the demand evaluation based on the survey information that we do have and sort of the limitations that we've spelled out of that data point and that particular estimate, and and the other bookend being these counts on the ground that we understand, you know, in their own way have some limitations, and we feel very confident that what's happening for each institution falls somewhere between those 2 points at sort of that peak period of parking demand. And that demonstrates in my mind that we are falling at that, you know, nice balance point of having the supply that is needed for parking, so that there isn't sort of that spillover effect to a significant degree, and acknowledging that there, you know, there is always going to be what you were sort of speaking to in that experience of folks wanting to find sort of the most convenient space to where they're landing. So I do think we are in between those two bookends, and I do think that from what I've seen from the data that you know, the institutions in the current state are striking that balance.
Karen, it's like a confidence interval for parking demand, huh? Is that, would you describe it like that?
I would, and I think, you know, having multiple estimates that we can look to demonstrate this, I think is helpful and sort of a healthy approach to understanding exactly what's happening on the ground. You know, no estimate is going to be perfectly, you know, hitting the nail on the head.
Thank you.
Megan, were there other
Scott-
questions?
Scott has
Scott?
his hand raised. I'm wondering if he has a question.
I did, but I'm happy to defer to Commissioners Andy, but I did have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Scott.
Okay. So apologies up front for belaboring the point. But I'm still hung up on the margin of error. I understand why it's there, and I understand why there's two different sources to look at. But when this goes to the DRB, they're effectively looking at a couple of criteria that the proposed parking plan adequately serves existing and proposed development and user groups by the institution. So in other words, have you balanced parking supply and demand, and how are you managing it? So that margin of error is so big that on the plus side, you're meeting your demand. On the other side, you're not. So what am I in the DRB to think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I would again I would point back to those utilization counts which show on the ground. Sorry, everyone froze for me for a second, so I don't know if I cut out. But again, I would point back to those utilization counts that are showing what is happening on the ground. And even though that doesn't measure future demand, it does give us a better idea of what's actually happening right now, especially for the current, which shows a large surplus at UVM. And all the institutions have a surplus due to that.
So is there a basis for saying that other set of numbers is more valid?
I would say it's a really good indicator of what is happening on the ground right now. I don't know if I would say more valid, but I think it provides another way to look at it, and maybe a better way to put those numbers into context.
And could I ask a follow-up question about that for Josh and maybe Karen? I think when I asked about this before, Josh, you mentioned that you used the same methodology for this report to assign your survey results to different user groups on campus to help you with the, you know, creating what you anticipate the future demand to look like. And I believe that methodology was created by the folks at the Transportation Research Center. Is that true? Is this something that you consulted with them about, is just, you know, how to use that methodology in a situation where you have a much lower survey result? Do they have any concern about the high margin of error that's produced by that?
I wasn't at CATMA when we were working with the TRC on that. I arrived a year later. But I believe that the survey data from 2019, we had a larger sample size, so that was something that we didn't have to deal with. And I don't, there's something that I've heard that we've talked about this with the TRC, but I don't know if I can answer that question fully.
Okay, thank you.
Julia?
So did the TRC, I'm curious about their involvement too. What they were more involved in earlier years, but not with this specific draft?
So the TRC, so to give some background, a few years ago, CATMA brought this project in-house. We used to consult it out, and then we brought it in-house for the last JIP process. And then the TRC aided, we consulted with them on just the methodology for the survey, and figuring out the weighting and how to get that demand number. So it's the same methodology that we had used in 2019 to find the demand, but they didn't have any direct involvement on this report. No.
Alex?
I just wanted to have follow up with Scott. Where did he go?
He actually just had to leave. He has to also be on the Parks Commission meeting tonight. So he
Maybe-
just signed off.
Maybe you can, Charles, can, obliquely address my question, which is that, Scott staffs lots of different committees and boards, including the DRB, so that in presenting this plan to the DRB, he has to go and answer questions, right? I mean,
Yeah,
he's
right.
so
He will
like-
he will help CATMA bring this forward to the DRB.
I mean, so we've talked about this particularly large margin of error, and like that one, I understand there's a couple different methodologies involved, and it's like we have bookends, but on the other hand, it's big. So
Right,
I
and
don't know what to
I
do about
do, sorry, I'm sorry, Alex. Go
no,
ahead.
I just it's like it's out there. It's like, what, I'm not sure what to do about it. I would have a hard time presenting it myself to the DRB if I were in Scott's position.
So, I will say, and CATMA knows this, that we have asked several questions about this to try to make sense of this, both in terms of our own understanding of how to read the report and how to present it to you, and ultimately how to present it to the DRB as well. I think we understand and have communicated to CATMA that we understand the discussion of these numbers as bookends. I think that, in a lot of ways that can make a lot of sense. And certainly there are other ways that we're familiar with the uncertainty that margins of error can provide. I think, within our office, using census data, oftentimes, when we start to look at cross-tabulated data of things like home ownership or rentership and race and income, you start to find that the populations that are included in those cross tabulations become so small that you're dealing with large margins of error. So often what how we use that data is by presenting it with caution, that it is the best thing that we have available to know what's happening, but we know that it could carry a high degree of uncertainty. So maybe not the best example, but I think that that's just one of the ways that we've been trying to contextualize the dealing with the large margin of error in this report. But ultimately, I think one of the roles of the Planning Commission is to help provide any comments or feedback that you may have for CATMA and the institutions in the preparation of this plan, and ultimately for the DRB in their consideration.
Megan, let me ask a follow-up question on that one. And this kind of goes to one of the initial questions that I had asked on how this ultimately gets used, which is, if there's so much uncertainty in that number, well, how is that number going to be used? And what does that uncertainty do to impact on how it's going to be used?
That's a great question. And so one thing that we haven't actually talked about is that the institutions are actually required to submit an annual report on their performance of the plan, essentially. And one of the things that they report in that is those actual utilization counts. So I think, as Josh and Karen have noted several times, those utilization counts help provide a real snapshot of actual usership, I guess, on the campus. And so if we were starting to see in those reports that those utilization numbers were rising much further above either where they expected them to be or really were outpacing the supply, that would be one way that we know that the demand was probably much higher than we anticipated, that margin of error was probably in favor of the higher end. I don't know if Katma or Karen has anything else to add to that.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head with that, Megan.
Michael?
Yeah, I just think I think we really, really need new metrics on this because I don't really know what the consequences of this is. We're gonna say, okay, you need to go build more parking, which I don't think is an objective that probably most folks would advocate for a number of different reasons. So it's kind of I don't know, it's kind of besides the point. I think we really need to focus on getting objectives that are more actionable and more aligns with what people want to see from this in the future. So I don't know if that can occur via the annual updates or not, but I think that's kind of where I leave it at this point.
Yeah, and I appreciate that point as well, Michael. I think that in previous reviews of the plans that have been brought forward, the Planning Commission, and I think maybe even the DRB, have made it pretty clear that the goal of trying to balance supply and demand is actually not to see the institutions build significant additional parking. That's not, I think, what most people want to see as the outcome. I think that what we have seen be the kind of goals and objectives embedded in the Planning Commission and DRB comments have actually been about reducing the demand for parking.
Julia?
Yeah, I think I want to echo what Michael said on that. And, if the goal is to achieve that balance of parking without, massively increasing parking, I think it would be great for this report to also address decommissioning parking when there is significant surplus. It seems like, from what Karen was saying, that the institutions are within a healthy range right now. And so that isn't something that might be on the table in the immediate future, especially with, maybe some of these planned, residential projects. But I do think that should be something that this report considers in the future, as we try to shift away from single occupancy vehicle travel. I also, on the topic of the margin of error, I think it's helpful to have these two different metrics to draw on, and I appreciate what Josh has been saying about the usefulness of each certain metric in a specific instance. I think, given the fact that there's two of them, there could be three. I think it would be great to have, if UVM is looking to have this random sample as one of the things that they have in there, that's fine. But maybe if it's really reducing really increasing the margin of error because there's a smaller sample size, then having that survey go out to everyone and have that as also a metric as a part of this plan, I think would be really helpful. It would also be a good way to test the validity of that random sample when it's given. So that's one idea. Or, I feel like there's other ways to rebalance and try to draw out a more representative sample when it's just given to everyone. So it's kind of tough to, we're looking at a final draft document here, so it's tough to ask for, okay, this number is not functional, we need a new survey. I know that's not really feasible at this point here, but for future surveys, it would be great to have that possibly that different approach with multiple other methodologies that account for everybody, but then also try to separate people by user group and make sure that it pulls out those specific respondents.
Thanks. Megan, were there other questions that you had? That's
I think the only other sort of in the weeds question that I had flagged from your public comments and communications was, well, actually, I'm sorry, there were two. Hoping that Karen or Josh could better describe what the efficiency parking means. Did you already speak to that? I guess you did a little bit, actually.
Karen did speak to that a little bit in answering my question.
Sorry. So then, yes, the one other question is, there was a question about how Redstone campus is considered in both the supply and demand side of the parking for UVM. And I know for the Planning Commission's awareness, this is actually something that previous analysts and I have talked quite a bit about. And so I'm just wondering if maybe Karen or Josh could confirm. I know we've talked a lot about whether we should treat Redstone almost as like a satellite campus, like you do for other satellite facilities for the institution, since the parking, at least at one point, did seem to be exclusively for the users on the Redstone campus. And so just wondering if you could speak to that piece.
Megan, could you clarify whether you're talking about like the Redstone lofts and apartments?
Yes,
Or yeah, okay.
That's a great question. So talking about Redstone lofts separate from, Redstone apartments separate from Redstone lofts. But if there's any reason that any of the parking for Redstone lofts would be restricted only to those users, I think that'd be helpful to know as well.
Yeah, so just to clarify, Redstone campus and Redstone lofts and apartments are different. They're adjacent to each other, but one is UVM, one is private. So anyway, Lisa can talk to more about that if we need to get into that. But the parking for the Redstone lofts in apartments are only for Redstone lofts and apartments folks that park there, that live there.
Right. So was the parking and the users then calculated as part of the overall supply and demand for the campus, or were they held separately, similar to other satellite locations that we've talked about previously?
Yeah, so I believe this was something that came up in the last JIP process. Again, not something that I was a part of, but something that Sandy had filled me in on. And so we made some changes to how we looked at those folks. So that's why we have those numbers that show both the demand calculation with the Redstone lofts and apartments there, and also it without. So you have a better idea of what that looks like.
Great, thank you.
Are you all set, Megan?
Andy, those were the questions that I had flagged from the last discussion, I think, unless you had any other questions from the last discussion.
No.
I think that was it. But Josh, did you, or Karen, did you have other updates for us?
Beyond the ones that we mentioned and the UVM updates, no, not currently.
Great. So let me bring it back to the commission then on how folks want to move forward. We could be looking for more information, get more clarity. We could consider this further. We could look to advance this to the DRB with our comments? What would folks like to do?
I think we should advance it to the DRB with comments.
Okay, so where are others? Is that consistent with what others are thinking as well?
I think so. I'm sort of wondering what those comments are. Because
I think there's, I mean,
how they may be relevant to the DRB, because I think most of our comments have been sort of at a long range level, which is helpful context for them, but I don't know how many of our comments are related to their deliberations this time around.
yeah, I think it's not clear, but I think we should get them in, or it's in front of them. Bruce, were you looking to speak?
No, I can agree with what Julia said. I think it makes sense to make them, even though they're long-term.
Yeah, okay.
Advance with comments.
Okay, so we've made a number of different comments. A big one is the degree of uncertainty in some of the numbers and the methodologies that were used. The focus on not wanting to just add more parking, but to actually reduce the need for the cars. Megan, do you have?
I think integrating the TDM, the citywide TDM
Yes.
analysis with new objective goals for this study plan, whatever it's called.
Right. Yeah, recognizing that that's more of a comment for the city and ultimately the institutions in the next go around. I do think that that's important to capture as well. Yep.
But I think from the DRB perspective, an expectation that future reviews of this report might contain different, I guess, criteria or objectives than are in there right now.
Right. Yep.
You know, and with the degree, you know, in the methodology and the degree of uncertainty in the number, and the potential, you know, error analysis on that, I think that's fairly significant and impacts on how that gets used ultimately. Megan, do you have enough from us to be able to start putting together our comments for that?
Yeah, I think Charles and I both have been taking notes as the commissioners have been asking questions and providing their thoughts. So I think if those are the three big things that you would like your communication to focus on, we can figure out how to incorporate a few of the other maybe more specific points that are related to them into the communication as well. And what we have done in the past is we've written this, well, we've done it a couple different ways, I guess. We've written it and provided it to the chair to approve being forwarded on behalf of the planning commission. In previous times, we've also had the full planning commission review it. So I think Andy or the rest of the board, I'd be looking for your input on what you'd like to do there.
So let me bring this to the commission. Would you like to see the report and be able to discuss it before we advance it, or do you want to leave that, you know, to Megan to write it and me to go over it with her?
I'm confident in your abilities to execute the collective will of the commission, Andy, but if you want to do that, I mean, you know, what have we done in the past? Sometimes we circulate it by, you know.
Yeah,
by
we could
email
circulate
and
it. We certainly,
just-
I would certainly want to circulate it to everybody and give people a
Right.
chance to comment on it.
Andy, just a question for Josh. Josh, can you remind me when this is scheduled to go to the DRB?
Yeah, so we haven't submitted this to public hearing because we were waiting till the planning commission deliberated on it. So it will either go to public hearing on June 9th or the 20th. Depending on any changes we might make after this, like any small changes that we have to make after this meeting.
Okay, great. And Andy, there's no second meeting in May. Your next meeting would be June 13th. I know you're going to review it yourselves, and it sounds like by email, but it seems like we won't have an opportunity to discuss during a meeting.
So if it's going to be potentially at the DRB before our next meeting. We want to get our report to them, obviously, before that.
Yeah, yep.
Okay,
Yeah, we would work with you to make sure that it's ready for that meeting, whenever that meeting ends up being, but.
okay. So we wouldn't be voting on it, obviously, because we wouldn't have a warned meeting, but we could all provide comments to it. And if you delegate me to do the final review of it, I think we could do that, and then I could do that.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Okay.
I like that, as long as it, it's in accordance with public meeting law, that, do we have
Right.
to vote on this? And
Yes, because you'd be delegating me to do the final review and approval of the report.
I'd like to delegate Andy to review and approve the final report.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion by Alex, second by Julia. Megan, does that sound right? The way I just phrased that?
Yes, I think that that sounds appropriate, and I think I'll just remind the commission that, when we circulate a draft for your review, it's not for discussion across email, but if you submit comments individually back to the staff and the chair, we can make sure to incorporate them.
Awesome.
All right, any more discussion on that?
I
Julia?
just have one quick question. I know that it seemed like, Michael, you were supportive of the idea of having TDM principles sort of integrated into this approach more broadly, but I'm curious if others have thoughts on the specific idea of like defining the efficiency-based strategies more clearly in this document, and if that should be a part of this letter. Yeah, I think
I think that would be a good comment to include.
If we could have a definition that isn't circular, yes.
yeah.
It has
Thank
to
you.
go somewhere. It's like a transportation thing. It has a beginning and an end. That's all.
Are there other comments also that people would like to see in the report?
I mean, some things that we heard tonight were helpful in understanding the report, like the understanding of like what a healthy surplus is. So that may be more informational than like, actual comments on future changes or something like that. But that context is helpful.
Any more discussion before we go to a vote? All right, so we have the motion. We had seconded. All those in favor of the motion, say aye, raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, then that passes. That's what we'll do. We'll have our report to send to the DRB along the lines of what we discussed tonight. And Megan and Charles will circulate it. Folks could weigh in again, giving comments to Megan and or myself. And then we'll finalize it and get it to the DRB.
Great. Sounds like a plan. Thank you.
Good. Unless there's anything else, thank you all on this topic, and we'll close this topic out. So, Josh, Karen, thank you, and Lisa, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll move on to item 6, which are commissioner items. Any commissioner items? Seeing none, Michael?
Oh, we might get into it, but I just wondered if Charles had any thoughts on the first comment we heard and that was circulated by email on the historic synagogue, and what that might look like, and what the limitations are of the current zoning versus what's being asked for.
Yeah, so this property is in the boundary of 2 districts, neighborhood mixed use and a medium density residential. The prospective owner, Kidder Spader, who spoke, has sort of 2 different plans, one of which would not require a zoning amendment. It involves creating 2 residential units on the main floor of the former synagogue, and in the basement, a cafe, which is a permitted non-residential use in that residential district. I think longer term, he has some ideas about that basement level and that would involve a use that's not permitted as a non-residential use in the residential district. And so his initial question was, would this be considered for a zoning amendment? And because it borders the neighborhood mixed use district, I think there is some merit for at least considering it for a zoning amendment. It is a historic building, so there's some things to consider there, but it is in a part of town where I think neighborhood-based commercial uses are appropriate based on adjacent properties, but that's essentially where he is. I believe his plans are to move forward with what would be permitted today and then simultaneously pursue a zoning amendment for that property.
Charles, did he say what that future use might be?
He did. There were a few ideas. He's a business owner himself that involves some fabrication. So a fabrication is not a use that's permitted there. It would be office and fabrication together. Another use he's mentioned was a bar, cocktail bar type place. I don't believe he's anticipating going beyond 2 residences in any scenario, but I think if he were to successfully achieve a zoning amendment, I think there would be many different uses that could be permitted there.
Thank you. Sounds good.
I do know that the congregation, I believe maybe that's what it's called, does maintain use of an accessory structure on the property that is separate from the main building. So this synagogue would obviously have to be sort of deconsecrated, and it may have already been, I'm not sure, but yeah.
Cool.
Julia?
Yeah, I had a question about, the status of if there are any like active religious uses on it. So thanks for clarifying that, Charles. I used to live right around the corner from this park property, so I was really excited to see this email come in. I think given the fact that this parcel's it's kind of on a corner lot, it's like, somewhat a corner there. It's a really great location, I think, for a neighborhood commercial use or residential, more residential uses there. But I think it would be a suitable location for those types of commercial uses that you were mentioning. So eager to see this move forward. And I think it would be great to see that area of, I guess it's Archibald Street, just look a little bit more alive. I think there's the start of some interesting neighborhood commercial where there's burly axe throwing and some cafes that are there. But I think it'd be great to sort of extend that on the opposite side. And I think, this isn't, this should be a prerequisite for a zoning change here, but it is sort of a burgeoning artistic area. Like the Rats Mission area is often, the location for pop-up arts events and things like that. So, and actually there will be one on May 20th in that little area. So I think it'd be great if this could support the sort of creative activities that are happening in that neighborhood, either directly or indirectly.
So
Absolutely.
this sounds like it would be something good to put on one of our future agendas.
Yeah, and we're talking internally about kind of what that looks like in terms of when or how we bring it forward to you based on, Charles has had some great conversations, as he mentioned, there is a plan to move forward under the current zoning today, and so the communication is really about some future plans. For the commission's benefit, I think it's important to note that we hear a lot of requests for pretty discrete changes to zoning often, and we're trying to think through processes that we can use to help us evaluate, time sensitivity, impact, ability to help us move forward our goals so that we can make sure that we're balancing both the big things that we're working on in our office and these smaller requests. So, I appreciate that the communication was shared directly with you tonight and to hear your perspectives on it. And we'll talk about how and when this gets brought forward.
That sounds great. Any other commissioner items? All right, we'll close that out. Item 7 is minutes and communications, although now it's just communications because there aren't the minutes. So is there a motion to accept the communications?
I would like to move that we accept those communications.
Motion by Alex, seconded by Julia. All those in favor of the motion to accept the communications, say aye, raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, communications are accepted. And item 8 is adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by Julia, seconded by Michael. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye or raise your hand. Any opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank
And
you.
see you
Thank you.
in
Thanks.
a
Good night.
month or so.
See you in a month.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.